Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. Hey, this is one of our first episodes, so that's like the first time I'm hearing that real time. This is Scott Groves with the On the Edge podcast, and today we are interviewing Tyler Ballard, who got introduced to me through a close personal friend who I have a lot of political conversations with. And Tyler's an interesting cat. He's in his PhD program at Brown University, has a deep interest in all things political, philosophical, current events, and recently ran for Congress on the Libertarian ticket in Vermont, and I'm guessing, Tyler, you didn't win, or we might not be talking.
That would be accurate. I would have been in the House already yesterday or 2 days ago had I won, but no complaints that I didn't. I think it was a very useful experience to just get out there and ruffle feathers.
That's awesome. So we are filming this, and this will probably be released on a bit of a delay, but just for context, we're talking about this early January, right after Mr. Buffalo Man and a bunch of people raided the Capitol building. So had you won, you would have been part of that melee. But maybe we can just go there quickly, and I'd love to hear more about your history and getting into an Ivy League school like Brown and being a libertarian at a school like Brown, which I'm sure is maybe a little bit more left-leaning. But maybe just start with, I'm fascinated by anybody who's not part of the political establishment, who's like, hey, I want to exercise my right as a citizen. I'm going to run for Congress. So what did that look like? How does that even happen? Like, if I decided I want to run for Congress.
See, it was interesting just because knowing that I would have a better chance to win at the state level. That's why I chose to run for the state legislature. Really, it was inspired by a disdain for the establishment. I more recently spent time working for the GOP in Vermont, but I see that they're hardly inseparable from the DNC and all the other left-leaning Democrat progressives that run the state of Vermont. Not that they are ideologically similar, but they once they get in office, they behave the same. They vote on whatever egregious tax bills exist, anything to spend money and perpetuate the police state. So I got into it mainly because the seat in my district has been unopposed for a decade or more. And despite the fact that the person I ended up running against was a good friend of mine and was a colleague in the county and state GOP, I said, letting you win without putting up a challenge is just irresponsible. So thankfully with COVID, I didn't have to do any petitioning or get any signatures. So I just had to fill out an email form saying, hey, I want to run, put me on the ticket. And that was it. So it wasn't too bad.
So apparently Vermont is the easiest state to run for Congress in, because in California, I think I still would have needed 70,000 signatures or something to that effect. We'll have to look it up sometime. But
yeah, I think, even without COVID, I might not have needed more than a couple hundred. So I'm not complaining.
That's awesome. And talk to me a little bit, you said, and I tend to agree with you, that there's a lot of ideological fights, especially right now. We seem more polarized than ever in America. But you said something that I think really resonates with me is like, hey, two sides of the same coin, right? Like once they get into the office, there's a great book called The Dictator's Handbook that talks about like people they want to serve their personal needs, right? And their personal desires to stay in power, to have influence. And so it's kind of this thing where, yeah, Democrats, Republicans, I don't care. They get into office, and maybe the Republicans talk about, we're the party of law and order and less spending and smaller government. They never actually follow through. And then the Democrats say like, well, we're the party of the small guy and we want to help people. And then they never really do. And both parties just end up spending more money and more glut and more what have you. So you decided to run as a third party candidate. Tell us about, the party that you picked and why you did that as a third party candidate.
Well, I actually, it was sort of impulsive. It was about 2 weeks before the filing deadline for an independent candidate. So I was on the ticket as an independent just because that was the easiest mechanism for me to do it. And really, it was also inspired out of knowing that even though the person I was running against was someone that I would agree with most of the time, she had been in support of some bills that were devastating to our local economy. Where I'm from, Slate is a booming industry. It is the largest industry, largest employer, one of the largest employers at least. And recently, I think in 2015, our rep had signed a bill essentially changing some of the environmental regulations that go into land use. And it was a bill that had to do with changing particular regulations to make it harder to use the land for commercialized businesses like Slate. And it developed into a bill that said, okay, if you have X amount of impervious land that can't, take in runoff, you would get charged a certain amount of money. And it was going to cost local businesses, it was going to cost our county tens of millions of dollars. And that's tens of millions of dollars that that county doesn't have, and Vermont especially doesn't have at this point in time, especially considering it is based on tourism, skiing, snowboarding, leaf peeping. Vermont's a tourist economy, and if you do things to impact the local employers, it's just devastating.
And excuse my ignorance, but I'm guessing Slate has something to do with oil production. I'm guessing this is the new version of
Slate really is primarily used for roofing or other sort of carpentry.
Oh, got it.
It's just a rock essentially, the mining and whatnot.
So this is not fracking. This is not destroying the water table.
No.
This is exporting rock is a big industry.
Essentially, yes. I mean, some people may liken it to fracking in a way, but it's mining natural resources.
Nice.
For the exportation to be used for a building.
And so I know that you ran as an independent, but from our previous conversations and kind of the introduction that we got, I would guess, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I would guess that you consider yourself more of a libertarian. Is that a fair comment?
Wholeheartedly. And even more so, I mean, it teeters on the line between libertarian and classical liberal. I choose to use the former of the two because people don't know the difference between classical liberal and liberals, at least contemporary U.S. liberals, and that's a whole bucket of worms that we don't need to get into.
Yeah, I have found that most of these terms have been bastardized. Like if you read classical literature on politics and thought process and philosophy, what Americans call a modern day liberal is not what historically we would have called a liberal. That's more of a classical liberal, and I don't know, maybe we can circle back around to that, but you know, there's an ongoing joke, and I would consider myself more of a libertarian. I don't think I've ever actually gone through the process of re-registering as a libertarian in California, which doesn't really matter because now we have open primaries. But the ongoing joke in the libertarian community is like, oh, well, you can ask 100 libertarians what's a libertarian, and you'll get 100 different answers, right? Because there's a huge spectrum of what a libertarian is. So in your own words or in your own philosophies, and you can talk about, you know, specific policies or just kind of a mindset. In your mind, what is a political libertarian?
Again, yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that one. You know, no matter what you want to define a libertarian as, every other libertarian is going to define it differently. And fundamentally, I think that's why beyond the electoral system, the winner-take-all electoral system in U.S. politics, our inability to really rationalize what a libertarian is really hurts the legitimacy of the party and its organizations. But if I were to conceptualize what a libertarian is, it would just be someone who, much like Socrates would claim, is just minding your own business and doing what is right for oneself without doing harm unto others. And, you know, just being self-sufficient and not expecting others to do your dirty work for you. So if you can function independently and think for yourself, think independently, then you're more likely to be a libertarian if you believe that being self-sufficient is important.
Yeah, and you know, as soon as I start talking to somebody who is not familiar or maybe hears about the fringes of the libertarian movement or belief system, inevitably they say, oh, so you don't believe in firemen or roads, or, you know, you want to go back on the gold standard, or you don't believe the government should do anything. And it's like, no, it's not that aggressive, right? Like you can have some public works program. So maybe just talk to me a little bit about those things that libertarian gets misclassified, where, you know, if you tell somebody, I'm guessing, like I said, you go to Brown University, if you tell somebody that I'm a libertarian, they're like, oh, so you don't believe in schools? You don't believe in roads? Tell me a little bit about these fallacies of what a libertarian is and maybe what they believe.
Yeah, I think that to some degree, it's certainly a component of people thinking that libertarians are anarchists, and that's definitely not the case whatsoever. To some degree, I believe libertarians buy into the political system because it is seen as a necessary evil in order to have functional society. Where we get into problems with this sort of ideology is that there should be a threshold to which, okay, we're spending a certain amount of money on these services and they aren't doing what is expected of them, or they aren't maximizing the productivity that they should be getting with whatever budget that they have. It's when we have this extra waste that is coming at the expense of taxpayers that it becomes a problematic policy. And I don't think people that aren't familiar with what libertarianism is can differentiate between what is necessary and what is necessary in terms of costs and what is fat. They just think that, oh, you want to cut this service and this service and this service, not recognizing that if we cut some sort of administrative costs, that everyone benefits from having a little more money in their pockets or having money to expend elsewhere where the funds can be utilized more responsibly.
Yeah, and for people that aren't familiar, maybe this is the first time they're hearing somebody talk about really being a libertarian. Where do libertarians stand on things like, you mentioned minding your own business. So where do libertarians stand on things like, I don't know, let's just go through the hot ticket items, drugs, military, gay marriage. That's been settled, thankfully. We don't have to hear about that anymore. It's legal. Great. Perfect. That's how it was supposed to be. But there's all these hot button topic items, police brutality, the military, healthcare. Why don't you pick a few of the favorite talking points and just tell us kind of where the traditional libertarian might stand?
Well, to some degree, I differentiate a little bit from the traditional libertarian. All libertarians differ to a certain extent. But when it comes to things like drugs, they would more likely fall under the line of someone who is progressive and saying that we should treat drug addiction as an illness and not be penalizing people for making the decision to do drugs. That is their decision. It is their body. If they choose to do so, that's on them, really. When it comes to the police state, again, sort of progressive mindset, and that we should be doing what we can to minimize violent police interactions. But I think libertarians take it a step further by saying, hey, we should also have the right to defend ourselves because it's written in the Constitution that we have this right to bear arms. So yes, limit the police state, but also give us the liberty to do what is best for ourselves if that sort of judgment call is needed. Really, when it comes to things like social programs, it's sort of the mindset that if you can work, you sort of should work, but that's also not being completely brash and saying all social services are bad and unnecessary. Of course, they're necessary to a degree, but we also shouldn't be penalizing people that can work to support those that choose not to, even though they're more than capable.
Yeah, that's interesting. Going back to the drug policy, I think some libertarians are just like, hey, it should be a free-for-all. Whatever you want to shoot up, consume, smoke, snort, inject, whatever, it's your body. You can do whatever you want to do. And I think some people that are maybe a little bit more classically conservative, I hate to say Republican because it's a very loaded term right now, thanks to Trump, but people that are a little bit more classically conservative, they might say, well, yeah, that's fine to a point, but at some point there ends up being, societal issues, right? If everybody's a crackhead, they're probably going to be a lot more violent crime or petty theft or breaking into your house or whatnot. So again, libertarians fall on the spectrum here, just like Democrats and Republicans do. But would libertarians say a little bit more traditionally, hey, it's basically a free-for-all in the drug trade, whatever you want to put in your body, go for it? Or would they say, hey, maybe these drugs are legal and these ones, once we get to a certain schedule of narcotics, maybe there's too much societal risk there to make that fully legal?
I think to some degree it's more of the former. It's more that you can make these individual decisions for yourself so long as they aren't impacting the lives of others. And that seems to be my interpretation of the libertarian argument in favor of the legalization or decriminalization of certain classification of drugs. It's that when you're starting to lie, cheat, and steal other people out of their hard-earned resources, then it becomes problematic. And yes, there should be penalties for you using others to perpetuate whatever addiction or whatever habits you may have. Do whatever you want to your body, but don't burden others by your decisions.
Nice. Yeah. I heard somebody say, and I wish I could quote this source, something to the effect of legalize the product, but don't subsidize the results. meaning that, if you want to make heroin legal and I decide that I want to shoot up every Friday night, well, that should be legal. That should be my decision. But if I get to the point where I'm ODing and I'm becoming a drain on the healthcare system, or I become a addicted addict where now I'm, stealing my neighbor's front yard signs to go sell them and make money to buy drugs. Well, we can't subsidize or excuse the byproduct or the symptoms or whatever comes out of that just because we've made the drug legal. And I think that's where we get into a weird conversation of, there is probably some statistical proof that drug addiction leads to these other societal problems. And I think what some people on the right would be concerned of is like, well, if you make this all legal and we normalize it, then we're going to have to pay for the ramifications. And I think some people on the left would say, well, if we legalize everything, then we're going to have to pay for all these ramifications. So where does the libertarian show some compassion, but also say like, hey man, you made your bed, you lie in it?
I think the discrepancy between generally is how those sorts of addictions come about. I mean, there's plenty of evidence. We know plenty about how the prescription of certain opiates generally creates a drug dependency that results in other things like heroin or crack or whatever narcotic addiction comes as a result of it, whatever opiate addiction comes as a result of it. And I think that when it's at the hands of others that this addiction comes from, libertarians would be more sympathetic to the situation, saying that you didn't necessarily get yourself to this place, and it's not necessarily your responsibility to get yourself out. You had nothing to do with the addiction. You were just trying to relieve an ailment. But at the same time, it's saying that you also have to want to stop doing drugs. You have to want to not be addicted to the drugs. And if you don't want the help, it's not my responsibility to keep holding your hand and taking you to the water and making you get the help or paying for you to get help. If you want to change, you will do it yourself, or at least make a concerted effort to try to get the help for yourself.
Yep.
So to some degree, there is individual responsibility in the decisions you've made, whether or not they're completely your fault is sometimes arbitrary, so long as you choose not to try to better yourself.
Yeah, I'm taking some notes here for people that are watching the replay on video. And by the way, for anybody who cares, today I'm smoking a Davidoff Genevieve, awesome cigar, Nicaraguan, big fan. So we'll have to get you out here to LA when this COVID thing is over, and we'll smoke some cigars together.
Oh,
and
my goodness, yeah.
We'll talk in person for hours. I've got a lot of Southwest points, so we'll get you out here. Chris, we should make a note that we got to get
great.
Tyler out here to LA. I took some notes here, excuse me, because you said the word personal responsibility and individual responsibility several times. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on why anybody who talks about personal responsibility or individual responsibility is immediately in our current political environment, the Twitter mob, social media, kind of this 1984 newspeak that we're all experiencing. Anybody who even says the word personal responsibility, fiscal responsibility, individual responsibility is immediately labeled as heartless or not caring or racist or sexist or pick whatever the ism of the day is. Why do you think it is? Because I think this is what libertarians are always trying to get through to people, and it just falls on deaf ears. Why do you think any term surrounding individual responsibility has basically been villainized?
Well, there's this sort of collective ideology that people can't necessarily take care of themselves and that they need Big Brother, they need the government watching them. And that's sort of been the movement that we've seen more recently with the progressives, with the extreme liberals, that, yeah, we need Big Brother to hold people's hands so that they know what's best for themselves, because people aren't capable of behaving in manners that perpetuate whatever ideology that is being pushed at the time. So it creates this interesting scenario where the people are both expected to take care of themselves, but also kowtow to the government if they aren't doing what is exactly expected of them. And it really stems from this dichotomy we have between electing people as either trustees or delegates, whether or not we can have faith in our elected leaders to do what is best for their constituents, or this alternative where we elect officials and then they do what they think is best for their constituents, regardless of whether or not it's what they want. And so far, we're kind of hitting the latter part of that, where if you elect this person, they supposedly know better than the people that elected them. And I think that's where the responsibility, the onus falls off of the constituency, because they're not the ones making the decisions.
That's fascinating. I haven't heard this discussed before, this idea of, are we treating our politicians and our elected officials as trustees versus delegates? And I think that's beautiful. I work in the financial space, so I'm familiar with what a trustee does. For those that don't know, if my wife and I die horrifically in a car accident, our children are 2 years old and 4 years old. They don't know how to spend the $1 million life insurance policy. So we have written, these are the 3 trustees who make the decisions on behalf of my kids until they're 18 for a certain dollar amount, 25 for a certain dollar amount, and then even 40 for a certain dollar amount, because I don't want my 18-year-old to, have $1 million dropped in his lap. So we have trustees that are there to effectively watch out for them, tell them what's best, and make decisions for them. That's much different than a delegate who's like, hey, I don't have time to go to Washington. We can't take 30 million people from California to Washington to present our best interests. So you're going to be our delegate and go tell the Congress and tell, the government what the Californians want. And I tend to agree with you, and I want to make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth. You feel like politicians have turned over the last 100 years, maybe 10 years, 15 years, whatever, more into trustees versus delegates, right? Where they think they know what's best for us and they're telling us what to do versus being our representative and our delegate. Is that a fair synopsis, or am I putting words in your mouth?
That would be completely accurate and to the point that I was trying to make. Yeah, it certainly feels as though even if certain officials have best interests in mind of their constituency, they ultimately take it upon themselves to make that decision, regardless of if it's what is necessary or what is wanted by the people that elected them in the first place.
And, the word that gets thrown a lot around by, I would say, all parties right now is this idea of elitism, right? And it's whether it's elitism of the rich, it's elitism of the highly well Ivy League educated, of which you are becoming part of that class, or whether it's the elitism of the politicians. Why do you think that is in that political class? These lifetime politicians, or even newer politicians, as we're seeing. Why do you think there is this elitism where they think they know what's best for the people that they represent? And maybe in some cases they do, right? In some cases, maybe they are coming up with brilliant policy that helps the citizen. I don't want to assume that all things that all politicians do is bad. But why do you think there is that we've switched more to this trustee, do as I say, not as I do, versus delegate, let me go to a town hall, see what my people want, and then go fight for that?
I think there's multiple components to that problem. One is political ineptitude and ignorance. It's just that people genuinely don't care. Re-election rates are, regularly 80, 90 percentile. And so regardless of the performance of whatever public official, legislator, president, the re-election rates are extraordinarily high. So to some degree, it doesn't even matter what you do. I mean, in Vermont, we have the longest serving U.S. Senator in Patrick Leahy. And though many people are not necessarily thrilled with what he does, it doesn't seem like he does much. Same with Senator Sanders. They get reelected overwhelmingly every time. And whether that's just people don't care, or they don't know, or they don't care to know, or they just literally just see a name they know and vote for it just because that's what they've been hearing forever. That contributes to the problem, because no one's holding legislators accountable for not doing what the constituency wants them to do. But then it also is, to some degree, I think that once someone is in office, they're surrounded in an echo chamber of people who are experiencing the exact same thing, is that they can get away with murder and no one will bat an eye. So when you have a group of 435 in one chamber and 100 in the other, this groups of people just experiencing the exact same political inefficacy and ineptitude and ignorance, you're going to start to believe that no matter what you do, you're in the right, because you're going to get reelected. People aren't doing things in the best interest of the constituency; they're just working to get reelected. by any means necessary. So even if there is some sort of stirring back home, that can be squashed by, just saying, hey, I tried. I wrote this bill, or I proposed this amendment on the bill. I took it to the floor. I called for a vote, whatever. I mean, I put in my best effort, but, it doesn't matter. I tried at least, and that satisfies the mob until the next, instance.
Yeah, we're here in California, and maybe Chris can look up. Chris is our wingman here in the podcast studio. He can look up what district Adam Schiff represents. I don't think he's our district, but Adam Schiff. I don't care if you are a MAGA red hat wearing Trump supporter in California, which there aren't many of them, but if you are that, or if you're the most progressive, I hate Trump, he should have been impeached on day one. I don't care which camp you fall into. You should be frustrated with Adam Schiff, because Adam Schiff is a congressman here from California, and basically the sole focus of his last 4 years has been anti-Trump, get Trump impeached, start a special counsel on this. And that's fine. If you're a progressive and you think Trump has to go, that's a part of government, and there's a reason we have the impeachment process. But as a Californian, I'm like, well, the housing market here has done pretty well. Tech has done pretty well in California. We've got a lot of problems with homelessness. We've got a lot of structural problems in California. I would like my congressional people to be working on the problems of California versus this 4-year chase of trying to dethrone Trump, because at the end of the day, love Trump, hate him, doesn't really matter. He didn't have a whole lot to do with California politics or the California economy. He probably didn't have a policy that really affected us deeply until COVID, and they shut down the travel ban, which they probably should have done sooner. Most Chinese nationals come through California. So it's just, I would have liked to see Adam Schiff doing some stuff for Californians instead of being the, cheerleader for the anti-Trump movement. And again, I don't care if you love him or hate him. You should probably want your local representatives to be doing more to help the local constituency versus serving some grander political scheme of getting a president in or out of office. And I tried to have this conversation with a lot of my friends, and it basically fell on deaf ears because nobody cares who they vote for in their local elections. It was so annoying.
Yeah, exactly.
So where does Adam Schiff serve, Chris?
Yeah.
You were able to find that what district he serves?
I already know that. It's Burbank.
Oh, it's Burbank. There we go. Yeah, so it is a district that I used to live in, so that's awesome. He's done very little to help the city or area of Burbank and the surrounding metropolitan, but man, if he hasn't been on MSNBC or Fox or whatever 3 times a day trying to get the president impeached, again, I don't care if that's part of your process and that's part of your political belief. Great. I want you to support an impeachment process if you don't believe the president is serving his duties, but I also want my congressmen to be working for some of the local things that need to be fixed, and yeah, we don't have everything figured out here in LA. If you couldn't have guessed.
Yep.
Let's go back to a couple of those other things, because I want to really drill down to what is a libertarian, and you mentioned briefly the police, right? One of the things that I know to be true is that libertarians have been screaming from the rafters for at least 20 years about the growing power of local and federal police. And obviously in 2020, this came to a head with the tragic death of George Floyd and the riots that came after that, which were after the 99% of people that were going through peaceful protests. And I wonder why libertarians have gotten this so wrong on the PR front, where they haven't been able to cross the divide or the political chasm and been like, hey guys, this is what we've been talking about for 20 years. We should, whether it's defund the police or retrain the police or take away some of their, overreaching powers and no-knock search warrants and things that, Rand Paul has been trying to get legislation passed on. But what do libertarians believe, first of all, on we'll call it police? And then why have they effed up the marketing so much? Because I think most Americans are more in line with what libertarians believe, and libertarians have just screwed this up on the marketing front.
Well, libertarians generally would fall under the line of limiting police interaction, limiting the size of the police force, and also doing away with qualified immunity and holding police accountable for their actions when they do, make mistakes.
Can you explain that to the viewers? Can you explain that to the viewers? Because I think qualified immunity is something that gets talked about a little bit, but I would say 99% of people don't understand what qualified immunity is and don't understand the power that police unions have.
Yeah. So essentially, qualified immunity is the mechanism that prevents government officials and even the police to some degree from facing discretionary action or facing any sort of repercussion for their actions while they are serving. Essentially, it just prevents them from being charged with crimes. I mean, that's a very layman's term, a definition of it, but it prevents people from being held accountable for their actions, especially those that are public officials and supposed to be serving the public.
So let me tell you about one of the times that I got a gun pulled on me by a police officer, and I'm more than happy to accept the fact or admit the fact or at least have logical conversation about the fact that maybe if my skin was a darker tone, maybe I end up being shot. Like that's a very real possibility, and that's a very real belief of a lot of people in our country. But let me tell you about the one time I got a gun pulled on me. My parents had been having this ongoing bitter fest with their neighbor. He had dogs that were just brutal. Like basically my parents couldn't enjoy their backyard for years because these dogs would just go wild, these two big canines, German Shepherds. So after about 2 years of this, I remember my dad going out to the backyard, and I think the Lakers had lost like a tight playoff game. And he's just kind of back there lamenting about the Lakers losing or whatnot, and the dogs start going wild. And so he just kind of flippantly says, F these dogs, I can't wait till they die. And the neighbor who was outside felt that was a threat against his dogs, starts mouthing off to my father about, what a horrible neighbor is. And at one point, the neighbor really crosses the line and says something to the effect of, be careful, I might just come over in the night and rape your daughter. To which case my father, who's a pretty large guy, tried to go over the fence and legitimately kill the man and kill the dogs, and myself and my sister's boyfriend and a bunch of people are holding him back. It's just brutal. Anyway, fast forward about half an hour, my parents called the police, the neighbors called the police. The neighbors show up, and the neighbor happened to be, I believe he was Muslim, I can't even recall. When he called the police, he said it was a hate crime. So when the police finally showed up a half hour later, they showed up guns drawn, everybody down on your belly, cross your legs behind your head. They thought they were responding to some crazy, hate crime or act in progress. And I'm sure my mom used the word rape. I'm sure the neighbor used the word killing my dogs. And, the police show up in a really bad situation where they don't know what they're walking into. But we all had guns pulled on us. I'm sitting on the sidewalk with my father with handcuffs on. That was a lovely experience. Everybody, they ended up figured out that it was just a neighborly dispute. Everybody was released without charges. But correct me if I'm wrong. Qualified immunity means that if they roll up to that neighborly dispute and one of the officers has an itchy trigger finger and blows me away, completely unjustified. We weren't rushing the police or we weren't resisting arrest. But if he makes a mistake and he misreads the situation and he puts a bullet through my chest, he cannot be sued, right? Right? He can't. I mean, that individual officer, because of qualified immunity, cannot be found individually responsible for killing somebody incorrectly. Is that a fair assessment of what qualified immunity does?
More than likely, it would be the case if they couldn't be sued, and then obviously they wouldn't face legal action. It seems to be the case that with most circumstances of unjustified shootings recently, it takes just public pressure to get any sort of disciplinary action against individual police officers. I mean, the strength of the unions and the binding of really tight immunity legislation prevents individual actors from being held accountable when they do something that's completely irresponsible and abhorrent. So, yeah, that would likely be the case, is that unless there was extreme pressure, external pressure, they probably would get away with it. And that's the reality that we're facing. That's something libertarians have been against for, eons, it seems like, probably longer than I've been alive. Just because that is certainly problematic when individuals with that much capacity to do harm are not held accountable when they use that power arbitrarily.
Yeah. And I always like to be a little bit solutions based. What would the libertarian solution be to, overreaching police power or, police brutality or police being able to seize property with basically, with no with no probable cause. What would the libertarian response be? Because I think we can all agree that we need police at some level. Probably need them to be a little bit better trained or equipped, in their style and personality, not more equipped with their arsenal of weapons. But what would kind of the libertarian solution be to, what we've seen as a growing police state on the citizens of the U.S.?
See, it's really a complicated solution because you hit the nail on the head again. It's that to some degree, it's recognizing that there is a need for these people to uphold the law and keep the peace between individuals. But at the same time, it's that they need to be held accountable for their actions. Doing away with qualified immunity to some degree, which is a bill I definitely would have been writing had I won my election, that needs to take place. Whether or not there is better weapons train or I guess conflict resolution training, or well, traffic, or cutting the budget, or even trying to pick apart at these police labor unions. That there is a solution that is possible, but it's very convoluted. So doing away with qualified immunity and making it possible to hold individuals accountable for their actions is a necessary first step.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also, and we film out in my garage here, so I also get traffic noise in the background from time to time. I'm very sympathetic to, police officers, sheriffs, anybody who's in that line of duty. It's an insane responsibility to have to make those decisions and carry a gun. And I have close friends that are police officers. The gentleman that I would consider a second father to me, he was a lifelong sheriff. He retired. Maybe we can get him in here and talk about that. So I'm really sympathetic to the decisions that they have to make. I just feel like maybe with many things with politics, that pendulum has swung a little bit too far. And again, whether it's the unions or the benefits that are now starting to cripple states with unfunded pension liabilities, or the qualified immunity, it's like it feels like the pendulum has maybe even swung a little too far. And I think even some police officers, if you could talk to them kind of off the books, they might even agree. But yeah, hopefully we can have some more common sense policy where this idea of defund the police is just pure silliness. It's just pure political propaganda. Yeah. You can't defund the police. But maybe adjusting funding or adjusting training and starting to swing that pendulum a little bit back more to community driven conversations versus, the police officers that I see going into the donut store when I'm picking up a donut, they look like SWAT team. They look like they're ready to take down Al-Qaeda in the middle of Fallujah. So yeah, interesting. What are some other big pet peeves of the libertarian movement or the libertarian philosophy as it pertains to our current political environment, our current spending environment? I know libertarians are kind of what conservatives say they are, which is they would like to decrease spending and cut the federal deficit. But what are some other big pet peeves and beliefs of the libertarian, the modern libertarian?
I think one of the primary obstacles, one of the pet peeves, is that they just can't get to the table. They can't bargain with the major players of the political institution. And it's mainly because they aren't viewed as legitimate. They aren't as well organized as the other parties. And that again comes back to our conversation about elitism, is that money buys access and access buys power. Power is, the mechanism through which we can exert our influence on the masses and on the constituency. So I think for libertarians, it's that watching that to some degree, they fall on both sides of the ideological spectrum, but no one's going to give them the time of day to listen to. So it's that the libertarians bridge the gap between extreme conservatives and extreme liberals, but they don't have the mechanism or the institution to be able to be the mediator between those parties or those ideologies. It's that they are the solution, but no one allows them to be.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Libertarians are the solution, because I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would say something that I have seen in libertarian circles, Facebook groups, libertarians were way out ahead of the gay marriage conversation. Mostly because libertarians don't think the government should be involved in regulating marriage at all. Yeah. So marry whoever the fuck you want to, right? Like it doesn't matter. It probably shouldn't be regulated all at the government level. So that would probably attract some people, at least 10 years ago, before this was a settled debate, that would have attracted some people from the left and maybe even the far left. On the other side of the equation, I feel like libertarians, again, for probably a couple of decades, have been talking about some type of balanced budget amendment or, cut to spending, which sadly only the fringe of the Republican Party seems to believe in anymore, reining in spending. So it is interesting that there's these ideological issues that could really bridge the gap between the two parties. But one, to your point, they don't have a seat at the table. They're not as well organized. And two, I mean, we've got to talk openly about the fact that they've lost the PR game, right? So let's talk about the Gadsden flag. Like, the Gadsden flag has a rattlesnake on it, which I get. And we'll have Chris, when he edits this for the bathroom breaks, put up a picture of the Gadsden flag. But it's like the Gadsden flag has a rattlesnake on it. That's not the most inviting symbol of a party. And sadly, it's been looped in now, the Gadsden flag, the yellow, the rattlesnake coil, don't tread on me. That's unfortunately been co-opted by some bad players, right? Some of these white national groups or the Proud Boys or some of these people that are really bad players. They've kind of co-opted that "don't tread on me" type philosophy. So maybe you can explain the Gadsden flag to everybody, what it means, and then you can talk a little bit about libertarians either losing the PR war or how they could do better.
Well, I mean, the Gadsden flag really is the symbol of keeping the government away from interfering and encroaching upon individual liberties. It seems to be the message that is trying to be portrayed with this symbol, with the flag. It's been memed to death, especially in 2020, to, I guess, sympathize with people on the far right that would be otherwise categorized as bootlickers. So it's just been delegitimized because the Libertarian Party is now being looped in with things that they don't associate with at all, like far right or far even moderate conservatives trying to pawn themselves off as libertarians, and that's certainly not the case. So the PR issue comes to the point that it's another organizational thing. It's that I think Jo Jorgensen lost some support among the libertarian movement when she came out in support of BLM, and that was an interesting tidbit. But even to that point, is that she, the Libertarian Party wants to claim that it's a party of individuals who are free thinkers and free from government interference, or want to be free from government interference and want to be individual cognizant thinkers, but at the same time also want to fall under the mantra of a single unitary party. And those two ideas are completely just contradictory. You can't be a unitary actor and a unitary organization of individual actors. It just doesn't work. You have to pick one.
Yeah, that is the intrinsic problem of the Libertarian Party ever rising to national prominence. Is it's hard to espouse the values of being an individual and then asking people to work collectively in a group, right? Which is theoretically always been the problem of America. But now,
exactly.
Now it's really pointed out in the fact that, like, Jo Jorgensen, who I voted for, by the way, who's the presidential candidate on the Libertarian ticket. It's hard to create a coalition when you're specifically trying to create a coalition of people who want to be extremely individual.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about the Libertarian Party now. So you mentioned Jo Jorgensen. She was obviously on the presidential ticket in all 50 states. I think she got somewhere around 1 or 2% of the popular vote. Talk a little bit about the Libertarian Party, what that means, what that is. Because even if I Google, I think the Libertarian Party of California, it's like disjointed, and the website looks like something from 1999. So tell me a little bit about the party itself, maybe not the philosophy.
Well, I mean, the party itself isn't necessarily that old. I think its origins go back to the 1970s. And Chris, if you want to fact check me on that, have at it. But I think that's reasonably accurate. I don't know. It was initially we go back to classical liberalism. It was supposed to bend that ideology a little bit, but be completely that classical liberal ideology in a legitimate form. And to some degree, it's lost just because third parties aren't viable in the United States whatsoever, given the winner-take-all electoral system that we have. So, and organizationally, it's small. Like, it's not very significant. I mean, most people haven't even heard of it, and that's entirely problematic when you consider that it is a solution to our extreme polarization in the United States at this time. But as an organization, it's just rather insignificant in terms of funding and structure to be able to compete with both the Democratic and Republican parties. So it's supposed to be a bridge between the two, essentially, but it's a relatively new party. And even though it's founded upon a very, very old ideology, but it's just not viable at this point in time, or probably ever in American history, so long as its electoral system doesn't change.
Yeah, yeah, and we're seeing some of that, right? We're seeing some of the call and the outcry for a change to the electoral system. Maybe go to the popular vote, which I think that has all kinds of unintended consequences and problems that stem out of that. I would not encourage anybody to want to go to a popular vote type outcome for a myriad of reasons we probably won't get into here. But maybe you can mention that, and maybe this is a media thing, this is a bias thing, this is an ignorance thing. You mentioned it and I mentioned it. The Gadsden flag has been memed to death and then looped in with that, kind of white national fringe side of the, I won't even call it the Republican Party. I'll call it just extreme, crazy conservative. I don't even know what I would call them. Fringe anarchists. I don't even know what I would call them. But
Sure.
how do people like us who have libertarian beliefs decouple it? If I talk to a friend of mine or a business associate, who's more in that California liberal progressive camp, how do I decouple that in their mind of like, no, man, this is what I believe. This is what these batshit crazy people believe. And this is why my vote wasn't wasted, because this lady, Jo Jorgensen, more closely aligns with my beliefs than a Trump or a Bernie Sanders or a Joe Biden or an Obama or a Romney or whatever. How do we even start to have that conversation? Which is so hard to have any conversation these days in America. But how would you start to have that conversation, with people that just obviously haven't been exposed to this or clearly don't believe the same thing that we do?
It's similar to as if you're running a political campaign. It's that you have to nail on things that you agree with people on. If I'm talking to, again, like a California or a Vermont liberal, I'll talk about things like the police state. I'll talk about things like drug and crime reform. You have to hit on the key areas that you agree upon. You have to rope them in somehow before you can say, okay, well, here's where we may differ, but it's not that big of a deal because I still believe in X, Y, Z. Even though these things may be different, I think we're aligned at least half, if not more of the time. And we want the same thing for society. On the other side, I mean, this goes back to the Gadsden flag being the moniker for the Second Amendment, essentially, and everything else, Bill of Rights. It's that, okay, well, we want the same thing in terms of upholding the Constitution and securing individual liberties, but I don't necessarily agree with your social policy. But these are things that can be remedied by saying, leave me alone. We don't need the government to interfere and mediate between these issues, that these are things we can do ourselves because we're adults and we should be capable of having these conversations.
Yeah, you brought up something really interesting. The Gadsden flag and the libertarian movement has basically become the poster child for the Second Amendment, right? And I think the Second Amendment gets talked about a lot because obviously there's kind of this endless slippery slope that is real, not just some perceived political device, but it is real that, as you take away more and more and more and more and more aspects of gun ownership, I would have more respect for progressives or the Democratic Party if they would just come out and honestly say, like, hey, we want to get all guns out of the hands of Americans. Like, I would have more, that would be more intellectually genuine than them saying, like, well, this year we're going to take away magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. And then next year we're going to try to attack this state to take away silencers. And then this time around we're going to take, like, let's just be honest, the end result is to end gun ownership in America, and that's okay if that's your belief. Just be honest about it. And so I feel like the Second Amendment is this one place where conservatives, libertarians, everybody in all the flyover states, as most politicians would refer to them as, they've really held on to guns as like, hey, at some point we have to make a stand on some issue. Why do you think that issue has become gun ownership for the right?
I think it's easier for individuals to attach themselves to something tangible. When we think about things that are in the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, assembly, protection from unwarranted searches and seizures, no self-incrimination. These other things aren't necessarily tangible. Firearms are, and they're also a physical display of power, a physical display of restraint and resistance. And they're the mechanism through which conflicts are often resolved, and have been resolved throughout recent human history. So I think it's a tangible thing that people use to feel as though they have control, especially when the government is doing its best to infringe upon individual liberties. It's the equalizing effect to overarching government.
Interesting. And what would you say to those individuals or talking points or bumper stickers? It's like, well, why would a human ever need a automatic rifle? Why would a human ever, how is your gun in your safe, Scott, ever going to fight back against the government having drones and tanks if the government does decide to overthrow you? Like you're just being silly, right? So how would you push back on people that they just say, you can insert anything. You can insert the word AR-15. You can insert magazines that hold 30 rounds. You can insert having a gun at all. But what would you say to the people who are like, why would you ever need X?
Being armed is in and of itself a debilitating effect on the government. It is a display that you're not just going to roll right over me. You're going to respect that I have power as well. And even if it's not the same firepower that you have, we also have to remember that the military is full of people that are like-minded and wanting to protect their individual right to gun ownership. So to just say that your ownership of weapons is arbitrary because the government's going to do what it wants anyway, well, not necessarily. It's a lot harder to take down a people that have the means to defend itself than individuals that don't. And we've seen that time after time in countries that have oligarchs or communist regimes. It's really easy to take down people and silence people that can't defend themselves. And sometimes when you come up against a match that would be more strenuous on time and resources, it's often not worth it. We see that in philosophy for international relations when it comes to making war. If the benefit from going into conflict doesn't outweigh the costs and time, resources, money, weaponry, and bodies, then you're not going to pursue it. If you have to put in the effort, it's just likely not going to happen, especially since the government is an unorchestrated mess anyway.
Yeah, so really firearms as a deterrent from more government overreach or just, doing the calculus. Like right now, I would probably think that most Americans, if they understood what was going on, would not agree with China shipping off a bunch of Muslim Chinese to detainment camps or whatever they're doing there in China. Like it's now been proven by really brave journalists in China that the Chinese government is just putting Muslims on trains. Just circa World War II, Nazi Germany, they're putting them on trains and they're just shipping them out to the middle to work camps and re-education camps and detainment camps. You can call it whatever you want. It's the same thing. I think most Americans would disagree with that. But if we're doing the calculus, it's like, well, are we willing to go to war with China to stop that egregious situation? Probably not. I guess what you're saying is there's some calculus eventually where the government says, even the United States government, we cannot enslave people, our citizenry, to a certain level because there's a calculus there if they're self-armed. Is that a fair correlation, or am I making that up in my head?
I think that's a fair correlation. I don't know if Chris has the number of how many gun owners there are in the United States, but I can probably assure you it far outweighs the number of active military. And to some degree, you say well, is this a risk worth taking on, especially when, I mean, to go against people, to go against your own people is completely just abhorrent as it is, and undermines the doctrines that founded this great country that we live in. So, yeah, to some degree, you would just say that the math doesn't make sense for us to engage in this conflict. We're going to be much worse off if we do this than if we just muddle along and let things be.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think somebody watching this who doesn't share the same views and I do, the same views that you and I do, at face value, they're rolling their eyes right now, right? They're like, oh, well, the U.S. government's never going to come after you. They're never going to try to do whatever, enslave their own citizens. They're never going to try to take you over where you're going to need to fight back with guns. And I think the average Republican, the average Democrat would be rolling their eyes right now being like, oh, these crazy libertarians who think one day there's going to be a civil war. But then simultaneously, those, we'll go with the Democrat and then the Republican, simultaneously, that Democrat will say the police are trying to execute a certain cross-section of America and they're working with racist tendencies. And the Republicans would say the government is 100% trying to take away our livelihood by shutting down my business or taxing me at 50%. So it's like each party has kind of their own example of the government overreach taking away civil liberties. But then when you and I or other libertarians say, maybe you want to have guns in case they decide to go to the next level, they're like, nah, you're crazy. That would never happen. And I'm like, wait a minute. 30 years ago, you probably would have thought this other stuff was crazy.
72 million.
72 million gun owners in America. And apparently the average gun owner owns somewhere around five or six firearms, because I think there's something like 500 million firearms in America.
393 million.
393 million firearms owned by 70 million people. So your average gun owner probably has 5 or 6 guns. That seems about right based on the gun owners that I know. That's a big populace to ever try to take over. We've gone almost an hour and we haven't even brought up COVID. So tell me tell me your take on COVID. Tell me your take on, I'm guessing what you feel is government overreach of shutting down businesses. What is your personal feeling or your political feeling or your libertarian take on the fact that the government has basically stepped in and told people who can and who cannot work over the last year?
See, it's been an interesting development because I'm sure that being in Vermont and being in California, it's two completely different experiences. For the most part, Vermont, up until recently, had very few cases. So most things, while constrained a bit, were still things were relatively normal. I mean, at least it felt like, excluding, some of the essential, non-essential business nonsense. But overall, it's been, to say government overreach in terms of who can work and who can't, whose business is allowed to operate and whose isn't. I mean, that overreach might even be an understatement. It's completely dictatorial in the way that we're saying this subset of people is not allowed to perpetuate their livelihood at the expense of, well, if they are, it's at the expense of people's lives. Well, maybe because the argument from the start of COVID that I completely jumped on and attacked was that, well, you're trading lives for money. If you go to work, if you want to live your life, if you want to do anything, people are dying, so you can't do those things. But at the same time, when you have people locked up, now suddenly we're seeing a mental health crisis. And, guess who called that 10 months ago or 9 months ago? I did, when I said, oh, if you have all these people locked up, we're going to see mental health issues because people are going to go insane. They're either going to not be able to handle the isolation, or you're going to have people losing their businesses, losing their livelihood, everything that they've ever worked for. And they're just going to, they're not going to do well. So it's not lives versus individual liberties. It's lives versus lives, and individual liberty should come to the forefront of the conversation and saying that if we're going to lock people up for wanting to live their life, I mean, don't be surprised when there are unintended consequences. So yeah, government overreach in every capacity of every capacity of the term is just abhorrent. So while I understand the necessity or the perceived necessity of some of these legislative policies that close things up, it's also recognizing that it's doing a lot more harm than good.
Yeah. It's such a disingenuous question when people would say, well, how many people have to die, Scott, so you can go to work? Or how many people have to die so you can go to a movie? Or how many people have to die so you can go enjoy sushi? It's just such a disingenuous question because everything that we do in our life has risk. You know, what if every single day we woke up, the news media showed, you know, the ticker tape on how many people died of auto accidents. I remember reading that auto accidents were the most socially acceptable way to die. Like whether it's a 16-year-old teenager that had their life in front of them or, you know, grandma at 80 years old running her car into a center divider, dying in a car accident is like the most socially acceptable way in America to die. And what if the media focused on this every day, that there's, I don't know, 50,000, 70,000 motor vehicle deaths in the country every year, you know, and every day they were reporting on that. And every day we started the question, well, Scott, how many people have to die for you to be able to have a right to drive to work or drive to the park or drive to the store? Nobody in their right mind would give up their car for 10 years or their ability to be mobile for 10 months or lock down their car for 2 weeks because 40,000 people a year die on motor vehicles. And maybe Chris can look this up because maybe I'm just pulling this number out of my ass. Maybe it's only 10,000 people die in motor vehicles. But at the end of the day, at some point, we do trade miles for death. Like we're doing that every single day. We're doing the calculus and we say, hey, products need to move, people need to go to work, people need to be mobile. And because of that, a certain number of people are going to die every year in motor vehicle accidents. And I just think it's so freaking disingenuous to start the conversation like, well, how many people need to die so that you can go enjoy dinner out?
33 to 36,000.
36,000 a year, 36,000 a year die in auto accidents. So, you know, it's such a false narrative that's being pushed. And now the funny thing is, or the sad thing is, the science is coming out that like countries that locked down versus countries that didn't lock down, indoor dining versus outdoor dining, not a huge correlation in the number of infections or deaths. I mean, it's just we've all been duped into giving up another layer of freedoms. And I think this is the stuff that when libertarians talk like this, it sounds like we're, you know, screaming at the sky is falling and Chicken Little, but it's really not Chicken Little because now we're seeing the ramifications of people losing their business. You know, I haven't known anybody personally who died this year of COVID. I've known 3 people that have committed suicide, and nobody will ever be able to convince me that the little nudge that those 3 people needed to commit suicide was due to the fact of social isolation, not having their church, not having their CrossFit gym, not being able to see their family, the constant stress and negativity of the media. Like, I will never be convinced that those 3 people weren't a COVID death. And they weren't a COVID lockdown death, not meaning that they died of COVID. So anything else I'm missing on this topic as far as the government overreach?
Well, actually, I've been reading, when I was writing the paper last semester, just an interesting piece, not even the government, the media being problematic, being the player in all of this, the primary just instigator of the politicization of COVID. And then even before it was a big issue, it was just recognizing that this is going to be politicized. It's going to be used as a weapon to perpetuate and push an agenda. And essentially, the problem with COVID is it didn't even become about trying to save lives. It became about, okay, well, how do I do what's necessary for me to get reelected? And we saw that, you know, governors doing that. We saw senators and House members saying, here are the policies I want to push in order to get reelected, that I know will get me reelected, regardless of the ramifications that they have or how altruistic it is, and as it relates to COVID. I mean, we could also look at the statistical inconsistencies when reporting COVID deaths. That's problematic. And that's been a problem since this epidemic even began back in late February, early March. And also looking at how the death rate in this country barely changed, how suddenly COVID-19 has displaced the flu as a seasonal virus in terms of casualties. So I don't know, there are a lot of micro inconsistencies that when people are open to actually looking at the statistical data, it's problematic and saying that COVID-19 is bigger than it actually was. And then we have to reckon with the fact that we've now permanently ruined lives for the temporary security of people to feel good that they might not contract a virus, when in reality, whether or not we lock down is arbitrary, because countries that had locked down are locking down again because their efforts didn't matter the 14-day curve has now, or the 14 days to flatten the curve, we're now on month 10. So it doesn't really make a difference, obviously. And you could say, well, people should be staying inside, wearing their masks, social distancing, physical distancing. Well, but when in reality, these same people will be like, oh, we have less of their cases of the flu because people are doing what they're supposed to do, and that the virus spreads differently, and we have the flu vaccine. It doesn't make a difference. It all comes down to politics. And depending on how your state, and the country behaved in response to COVID-19 will determine how well your state did at handling the epidemic.
Right.
It was all political, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it all felt very political, and there's two thoughts that I want to balance. Like, I don't want to completely disregard anybody who's in a high risk demographic, right? So I have a very good friend. He's a doctor. He's 72 years old. He's carrying a few extra pounds. He's got diabetes. He's got all the factors where if he gets COVID, he's screwed. He's in bad shape.
Yeah.
And a couple times when I've had to take COVID tests for social gatherings that I was either attending or had attended, got a negative COVID test, I would go over there and hang out with him and catch up because we knew I didn't have COVID. And we would still sit outside across the table. He would still wear a mask. And that's fine, because I think that goes back to the original root of our conversation. Like, that's personal responsibility, right? If he's in a high risk category, then you should absolutely take precautions as if you're in a high risk category. But he also fundamentally believes schools should be open, businesses for the most part should be open, and people should be going on their lives, due to the fact that he can earn his living at 72 off of his investments and off of Zoom and sit at home and have a high quality of life. He's also open to the fact that there's a lot of people out there that if they're not making their week to week $12 an hour paycheck or $1,200 or $12,000 a week-to-week paycheck, they can't afford to live. And he wants people to return to school, return to work, and he'll take care of himself, right? But this idea that we could exercise personal responsibility instead of a government mandate, somehow that's been lost on the populace, and I just don't understand it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and I think it goes back to the same conversation we had before about trustees, and that the government, and that people are looking to the government to tell them what to do. And because they think that the government knows better than they do about how to handle an epidemic, when we've seen previously that, the government is completely ineffective when it comes to handling these things because it's organically created. It's not a virus, much like the environment, is not something that can be contained in a test tube or put under a microscope. It's something that is going to spread and occur naturally, and no amount of legislation is going to make a damn difference.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned that this is going to spread organically, so you can't have a government solution to it. Because I was thinking about this actually, and I'm a big movie junkie, and I love bad movies. So I was thinking of the scene, and maybe you've seen it. Have you seen the movie Armageddon with Bruce Willis, where the asteroid comes down and they got to go blow up the asteroid? It's like this '90s super corny summer flick. So there's this scene that I keep thinking of where Bruce Willis is with his roughneck oil rig workers, and he's at NASA, and NASA's telling him that they need him to fly up into space and blow up this asteroid. And he just looks at him, and there's this great scene in the movie, and I'm probably gonna butcher it, but you'll get the gist. And he says, "Hey, this is your best plan? Like, my guys are your best plan? Aren't you guys NASA? Don't you just have smart people sitting around thinking shit up? Like, isn't that your job, to be smart and have the checklist for when this crazy stuff happens?" And I just keep replaying that scene in my mind. It's like, you're the CDC, you're the National Health Center, you guys have billions of dollars of budgets. Isn't there people way smarter than me just sitting around thinking shit up that, like, you have a checklist? All right, respiratory disease of unknown origin that has an unknown death rate. Here's our checklist. Here's the 97 things we do as a public at the hospital level, and I'm not even talking about the PPE and because there's an economic trade-off of how many, nobody would have thought till now that we needed 50,000 ventilators just sitting in a storage unit, but just the checklist of here's the things we do when a respiratory virus of unknown origin hits. And it's like, the fact that you guys, going back to that movie, you guys are NASA. Don't you just have smart people sitting around thinking shit up? But I think you hit the nail on the head that with this organic stuff that's going to spread no matter what level of government interaction, there's only so much you can do. And then it's back to us to take personal responsibility as personal responsibility as the individual, because the hive mind, as we've seen, probably isn't going to solve the problem much quicker than we could have. And that's it's problematic because I don't want to get into the habit of being a conspiracy theorist and never trusting the experts. But if the experts don't have something of value to add, then all right, cool. You experts go into a room and create the vaccine at record speed. And when the vaccine comes out, that's awesome. But until then, like, kind of let us do what we're going to do, I guess. I don't know. I'm trying to think through my thoughts as we're talking. So I might be coming across a little bit incoherently.
No, and again, it creates a similar scenario where it's like, well, we can have all this government overreach. We can lock people up and hold people indoors, but fundamentally, something has to keep society going, and that's us, the people, the individuals that make things happen. Government doesn't really make things happen; they just tell us what to do, and we could do without them to a certain degree. So, if we're all supposed to be locked up, what happens to the people that are locking us up? I mean, it's interesting. The do as I say, not as I do sort of mindset when it comes to public officials is that we're not okay to go out and have these gatherings. We're not okay to go to work, but they're still collecting paychecks that we're paying for. And they're still going out to social gatherings that are likely funded off of things that we're paying for. So where do we draw the line as individuals and say, just fuck them. They're not doing anything for us. Let's just do what we want anyway because they're doing what they want to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's frustrating, and we probably have the most egregious hypocrite here in California, which is Gavin Newsom. From the beginning, shut down all public schools. But my kids can go to private school that's still open. Oh, you know what? Shut down all businesses, but somehow there's this carve out exemption for the winery that he's an investor in, because that winery is outdoors and it's actually considered a manufacturer, not actually a restaurant. So keep my business open. Oh, and I want to go out to a nice $400 dinner at the French Laundry and eat indoors and be with my friends and hang out with my cronies and get my political donations. Well, that's okay. But if you need to go out to a restaurant to meet with your business, your business referral sources, we just have the biggest hypocrite in the state. And I think there's one of three things that is happening there. Probably one of two things. Either, Gavin Newsom, who is the governor of, what Californians like to talk about as the seventh biggest economy in the world, Gavin Newsom should have way more data points, daily briefings on what's going on with COVID. So either A, he has seen the data and is like, well, it's not nearly as scary as we're making it out to be, so I'm willing to take the risk-reward calculus of going out to dinner with my friends. That's number one. And that's scary enough that a politician could be living in this completely hypocritical state of do as I say, not as I do. That's scary. What I also think is possible, and this goes back to our conversation about the elitism, I also think there might be this subconscious elitism of like, well, I'm the governor, or I'm wealthy, or I'm a rich white guy, or I'm a politician, or I'm surrounded by the washed, and you uncleansed masses, you're the ones that are going to get the disease, not me, right? It's like, I almost feel like it's either a conscious decision to be hypocritical and screw his own constituents, or it's a subconscious, you guys are the unwashed masses that have to eat at McDonald's. I'm part of the elite inner circle of wealthy people who are clearly clean and not going to get COVID. And I don't care which one it is, because it has to be one of the two. And both of them are fucking disgusting.
Yeah, that's no stretch of the imagination. That seems to be the case. Particularly with Democratic governors across the country. I mean, we look at the irresponsibility of Andrew Cuomo. There's the neighbor next door for me, but we look at the many, many senior citizens he got killed by packing them all into nursing facilities when this first started. Is saying that, well, you can't, even if you're not sick, you can't go home. We're just going to pack you all in these facilities because you can't leave. And then suddenly he's got all these deaths on his hands, but he's still the pariah. And the savior of the state of New York because he's handled things so well, when in reality he's been completely irresponsible and then just goes out, and meets with his family or, gets his son out of trouble, does whatever the hell he wants. But then he's packing all of his citizens in like sardines, and they're all contracting COVID and dying, especially in New York City. Like there's this dichotomy between the top and everyone else.
Yeah.
And no one really likes to recognize that or do anything about it. It's just that, well, they're the elites, they're the experts, they know what's best, even though they're doing exactly what they told us not to do. We're just not going to bat an eye at it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't remember who the I can't remember who the moderator is of Meet the Press. Meet the Press is one of the few political shows that I'll still watch that's on network TV. He's going bald, and I wish he would just shave his head because the little weird comb over thing he's got going is a little annoying. But I remember the moderator of Meet the Press after the Trump election 4 years ago. He had a moment of real, I thought, vulnerability and self-reflection where they were interviewing somebody who was, the head of the agricultural Iowa, blah, 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 that was explaining to them why so many people voted for Trump. And in a moment of vulnerability and not sticking to the kind of political talking points, he said, looking back at this election, we as a media conglomerate started classifying people as, flyover states or the non-college educated or the uneducated. And he used a few adjectives. And then he said, if I was talking to my father, I think his father had passed. He's like, if I was talking to my father and he knew that I was describing more than half of America in this derogatory way, he didn't say he would kick my ass, but he had some real reflective thoughts on like, oh yeah, we've really become in the media, in the political elite on both sides of the party, on the coastal states, we've really become this group of people that look down at, anybody that didn't get the same college degree or doesn't live in the same metropolitan area. And you could just see it on his face that he then understood why Trump got elected, because he's like, we've ignored this cross-section of people. And I think it's that same hypocrisy, right? Where it's like, if you're part of the 70 million people in Party A that vote for Party B, the best thing that you can do is understand why 70 million people voted for Party B. Like, I might disagree with you. I might disagree with every single thing that comes out of Bernie Sanders' mouth, but I can understand why some people would vote for him. And I just feel that on both sides of the aisle, there's become this elitism of like, I know best. I can't even imagine why you would believe what you would believe. And that's a really scary point that I think we've gotten into in our country. And I think it starts with these politicians that are in this hypocritical mindset of the do as I say, not as I do. There's no chance that you could possibly have insight above and beyond what I know. And it's really terrifying to me.
Yeah, no, and then again, it is, to your point, it's perpetuated by the news media. What I was getting at earlier before I went on a tangent and completely lost what I was thinking was that I was reading a piece from some students, I believe from Michigan and University of Wisconsin, basically saying that the media is what was a driving factor in politicizing the issue, is that the media controls what is seen, who sees it. They have this exorbitant budget in order to control what people are seeing. And the vast majority of people still buy into the mainstream media, still buy into the large corporate entities that control information and control the transfer of information. So to some degree, the onus, as much as it's on politicians behaving erratically and not giving a rat's ass what happens to their constituents as long as they get what they want to, it's also on the media for picking and choosing which components of these issues are available to the regular consumer.
Yeah, I remember reading a similar conversation piece, and funny, I think it might have also been from the University of Washington. I wish I should have bookmarked that article. I blame Rush Limbaugh for all of this. So Rush Limbaugh proved with talk radio that you could make a lot more money as a quote unquote journalist or as a figure in the news media. You could make a lot more money trying to be somebody who creates the news versus somebody who delivers the news, right? And so I think we all like to opine for the good old days of Walter Cronkite. I, to this day, don't know whether Walter Cronkite was a Republican or a Democrat. I would guess maybe he was a Democrat because the news media tended to attract more people from liberal colleges. I would guess. I don't know. But, up until that, call it 1970s, maybe 1980s, the news was there, Connie Chung, Tom Brokaw, whatever, like these kind of heads of the media when I was growing up, they really, I feel at least, were there reporting the news. And then Rush Limbaugh and the whole shock jock generation, they figured out that you can make a lot more money and be a lot more a lot more financially viable, and you could become a cult of personality, and you could make tens and hundreds of millions instead of, Connie Chung maybe making $1 million, if you became the news and you became the opinion maker versus somebody who was just doing real journalism and, reporting the news and trying to do investigative journalism. So I blame Rush Limbaugh. And then, I cannot bring myself to turn on Fox News or MSNBC. I think they're both just two sides of the same coin. They're both disgusting. They're both 100% politically and partisan driven. But what I would like to see is people that watch Fox News understand why people tune into MSNBC. And I would like people that watch MSNBC to understand why people tune into Fox News. It's like you have to at least understand the opposition, because at the end of the day, we're all Americans, and I don't know why that's such a crazy thought.
Yeah. So psychologically, people in our society really love confirmation. They love, it's an issue of confirmation bias, where we isolate ourselves from any information that may be considered adversarial. And the fact that I'm, even considering opposing viewpoints as adversarial, already gives you a little insight into the fact that polarization is a problem. But why we can't overcome that is that we just like that instant gratification of surrounding ourselves with people that think the same way as we do, because we think we're right. Libertarians don't necessarily have that problem, because we're always at each other's throats arguing about what a libertarian is. But when it comes to, the left and the right, it's just that echo chamber of just constant reassurance of the same information being regurgitated in an increasingly extremist way, to where we're now separating ourselves even further than we had before. So the left and right aren't going to come back together until we get ourselves out of the, inherent mindset that we need to surround ourselves with people that think just like us.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously humans are very tribal, right? Like we're made to be in these small groups of 10, 20, 30, maybe up to, some people argue 100 people maybe, of these small groups of like-minded people that are all rowing in the same direction, because that's how we stayed alive for tens of thousands of years. And now social media has made it to where, I can find tens of thousands of people that are similarly like-minded on the same fringe beliefs, right? I mean, the fact that there's fucking Facebook groups of tens of thousands of people that believe the world is still flat. Yeah. I mean, it just shows you how tribal and how crazy we can be. And I'm sure some people look at me and they say, like, can you believe that there's Facebook groups of hundreds of thousands of people that want to own firearms, right? So somebody's looking at me the same way I look at the flat earth people. I just happen to be right, and the flat earth people are wrong. See, there I go, being adversarial.
Exactly.
But I don't want to blame social media for everything, because obviously there was a huge partisan divide. You can probably go back to the Clinton era, the impeachment over whether or not he was getting a blowjob in the Oval Office and whether or not he lied about it and whatnot. And then, the Democrats kind of retaliated with starting to withhold Supreme Court nominations and really challenging cabinet level positions. I think it probably started in the 90s. It got really bad in the 2000s, and then just pour lighter fluid on it, once social media came around. So what part, in whole or partially, do you think social media has with that echo chamber? Because I have the rare benefit of the fact that most of my business partners, my referral partners, are here in LA. They're more liberal. Most of my, ex-Boy Scout, ex-Army, ex-wrestling buddies are more conservative. So I might be one of the few people on social media that get it from both sides, right? To my conservative friends, I'm not conservative enough. I'm not wearing a MAGA hat. To my liberal friends, I'm a raving racist because I think maybe we shouldn't have to wear masks everywhere. I don't know how those two things are correlated, but somehow race always comes into every conversation if there's a disagreement. And so I get it from both sides, and I'm just like, whatever, man, I'm just trying to be me and make a living. So can you talk a little bit to what you think maybe social media has to do with that, or how it's kind of exacerbated that?
To say it's exacerbated it is right on exactly what I would have claimed is the role of social media in perpetuating this issue. I think it just makes this sort of tribalism even easier, just because it's, at a click at your fingertips that you can find people that will boost your own ego by essentially telling you that you're right in whatever line of thinking you may have, even if it's something arbitrary that is completely not supported by any sort of statistical information whatsoever. But all these people are telling you that you're right. You're believing the right things. So you begin to believe that without any sort of preconceived rationality about maybe using data, that you're going to be right every time because all these people are telling you that you're right, or that you subscribe to this group. So inherently you must be in either the camp of being right or being wrong. So where social media isn't necessarily the cause, because again, this has been decades long polarization at our dismay, but social media definitely perpetuates it. It magnifies the problem, exacerbates for sure. And to be honest, it really exposes a lot of our inability to have these difficult conversations with others, because we are choosing to not engage with groups or individuals that don't think like us. So to have that capacity to choose creates a whole different element, because we don't get to choose who we interact with on a daily basis. Yes, to some degree we do, but we don't get to choose our coworkers. We don't get to choose our boss. I mean, well, yeah, you do when you engage into a contract for work, but you don't get to choose a lot of the people you come across when you're walking down the street. But when it comes to social media, when it comes to Facebook groups, Twitter groups, you get to choose who you want to surround yourself with, and that it makes a big difference.
Yeah, there's an interesting talking point. Scott Galloway is a professor at NYU. He's become really popular. He's got a podcast. He's very big on commenting on kind of the intersection of business and technology. And one of the things that he said, because as he's become more popular, he's waded more and more into political and social topics. One of the things that he said, he's like, yes, social media is a big part of the problem. But he also has this interesting caveat that technology is also a big part of the problem. And his thought process is having everything on demand in a technological fashion is ruining those kind of ties that bond people from different ethnicities, socioeconomic groups, different belief patterns, because the reality is I can have a pretty freaking amazing life right now with the Peloton that's going to be over there in a couple of weeks, which means I never have to go to the gym anymore. I can go on the Peloton. I can pick an instructor that looks like me, who only listens to the same music that I do, that wants the same exact workout that I do, right? And so I don't have to go to the gym anymore and interact with people that look different than me or earn different amounts of money. And then with Amazon Prime and Whole Foods fresh delivery, I never have to go to the grocery store again. I never have to interact with humans that don't look like me or act like me or have the same political beliefs. Social media, Zoom, I can just black out anybody who I don't want to talk to or who doesn't act just like me. So he's one of the things that he's arguing is that this technological renovation that makes everything so much more convenient, it's also causing us to be even more and more in our echo chamber, only interact with people that are in the same socioeconomic group. And there's no cross-section of ideas, which I think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 100 years from now, when we're doing the post-mortem on COVID-19, I think kids not going to school is going to be one of the problems that emerges if it's like, oh, okay, well, now I don't even have to go to a college campus to interact with people that might look different than me or come from different neighborhoods. I'll just do everything on Zoom and I'll only opt into the classes and work with the type of people that look just like me and act like me and have the same interests. That's terrifying.
Yes.
But I also like the convenience of having a Peloton and having Amazon delivery. So what the fuck do we do?
No, it certainly is problematic, because we do in our society now, it's becoming ever more apparent that we value that instant gratification. It's that we get what we want when we want it, and we can isolate ourselves from others as a result. And we choose to isolate ourselves from others as a result because we get the things when we want them. So I don't know, how do we remedy that is problematic, because it would involve a lot of manipulation of maybe what's accessible to us, and that's completely counter to the free market ideology that you or I would subscribe to. It's saying that we don't have the free will to make these choices because it has these unintended consequences. But at the same time, you can't go around saying, at least you or I can't go around saying, you're not allowed to make those decisions for yourself, because
Right.
we run into the same problem of we got Big Brother watching us, telling us what we can and can't do with our lives, even if it has unintended consequences.
Yeah, and this is the interesting part where I think we get to, and I think this is a huge conflict with the libertarian mindset, with the classical liberal mindset, is the idea that social media is kind of the new public square, right? So if I am going to get on my Peloton and not go to the gym, if I am going to get Amazon Fresh delivery and not go to the grocery store, if I'm not even going to go to work anymore and I'm going to do, the last month I could have done my exact same job from a hotel in Cabo and nobody would know the difference, right? And so if we're going to accept that that's our new reality, and so ipso facto, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter becomes the new public square, I have these two competing thoughts, and maybe you can help me think through this. One is the free market capitalist in me says, well, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they're publicly traded companies that are private companies. They can do whatever they want. If they want to shut down the president's Twitter feed, if they want to make sure that I only see an echo chamber of my own thoughts by what they put in my feed, that's their prerogative. And if I choose to use their product, especially since I'm using their product for free, quote unquote, they can do whatever they want. But then the other side of me is thinking like, well, no, if we've limited society through this creation of convenience to where now Facebook, Twitter, Instagram is the new public square, maybe the government has to regulate that the way they regulate free speech, and you can't cut off the president's Twitter, and you can't just decide what Facebook groups can and cannot exist, right? The fact that Facebook can arbitrarily decide a Facebook group with 10 million people in there that says Trump is not my president is okay, but a group with 10 million people that says Biden is not my president is not okay, that's a scary precedent to me. And it's like, I want public corporations to do whatever they want to do because it's their business, it's their company. But I simultaneously am thinking like, if we're really thinking through all these other changes in society and that's our new public square, maybe we need to protect them. And I don't really care whether you belong to either of those groups, the Trump's not my president or the Biden's not my president. Like, should we at some point lay down the law that both those groups have the right to exist? And this is where my libertarian mindset gets fuzzy. So maybe you can give me your feedback or thoughts or just help me think through this issue.
Well, I have a similar dichotomous issue. It's that I believe that these companies should operate how they want to without that sort of strict interference, because they set the rules and for the people that are going to consume their product. But at the same time, it's also recognizing that, yeah, since these platforms have taken the role of a public forum, that to some degree they should behave as if they are not private corporations, that they should behave as if they are not that they're under the guise of the same laws that you or I would have to experience as individuals, that the government to some degree would act as if they are a public figurehead for perpetuating or ensuing free speech or freedom of assembly, that these same rights. But again, it creates this sort of constitutional issue as to whether or not these rights can be ascribed to a private corporation. And obviously, in most cases, the answer is no. We see that with the NFL, with years ago with Kaepernick and the anthem protests, how we saw that the government was coming down the side of, hey, you can't, or the Supreme Court coming down the side of saying that we can't tell corporations how to run their corporation. It's out of our hands. It's out of our jurisdiction. But at the same time, there's a public interest in saying, I have a right to utilize my constitutional freedoms. So where we draw that line is very unclear, because it would have to do a lot of just bouncing off of these social media giants competing with the government, and who do we want to win is very problematic, because I don't want either of these sides to win. I just want people to be able to do what they want to do, but that's not necessarily the case when it's under the control of a particular corporation or under the control of the government. So yeah, it's to answer your question, I don't have an answer.
Yeah. It does feel like certain, and I don't know if you could ever quantify an adoption rate or a number of users or something like that. It does start to feel that Facebook, for example, and we'll just use them because they're everybody's favorite, punching bag right now.
Yeah.
It does feel like Facebook has crossed the chasm of being a private company that has a product to now being more in line with a public utility. Just like we saw Graham Bell company get broken up because they basically had a monopoly on the communication lines in America, right? And the government stepped in and said, well, even though you're a privately traded company, you've effectively become a public utility, and everybody needs to have the right to access a phone line, because in modern day America, so this would have been, I guess, the 70s or the 80s when they broke up Bell. Maybe you can look that up, Chris. When did antitrust break up Bell Telephone Company? The government came in and decided, like, no, we've now reached a point where humans in America, in order to conduct business and be a functioning member of society, needs to have a telephone line. And due to the fact that you own all the telephone lines, you've now become a public utility, and we need to regulate you in another way. 1982 is when they broke up Bell. It feels like Facebook is kind of the same thing, because yes, there's Parler, yes, there's Instagram, and now Instagram's owned by Facebook, and there's Twitter, and there's locals.com. Shout out to Dave Rubin, who started locals.com. But it does feel like, I'll tell you tomorrow, if Facebook just decided, hey, we don't like the fact that Scott Groves is doing a podcast with a Gadsden flag on his hat, we're cutting him off, he can never be on Facebook, I immediately lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. I lose a big chunk of my ability to create my livelihood, because that's where my coaching group interacts. That's where I do a lot of my interaction for my mortgage business. So I feel in some way, Facebook especially has effectively become this public square / public utility. And to just be able to blacklist people and remove them from them using your platform to make a living, it feels a little bit more akin to like, okay, well, everybody has the right to a telephone. Yeah. But I don't know what the answer is, because I don't want the government coming in telling every corporation what they can and cannot do and who their user base is allowed to be. It's really a quandary. Can you please solve my problem here, Tyler?
Well, I think fundamentally it goes back to people have an overwhelming dependency on things, on material goods, and on computer, tablet, smartphone. The internet is no different from that sort of tool that creates the instant gratification that we all so desire and think that we deserve at every given moment. So I don't know what the threshold would be to say that like a social media giant like Facebook has crossed into a utility sort of platform, because fundamentally that also requires internet access, which I know a lot of people, especially where I'm from, have difficulty getting. And I mean, the argument saying that broadband access is a public utility that should be provided to Americans anyway. Then you get to the threshold of this is a utility within a utility, and I don't know where the threshold for that is either, because this is uncharted territory. Obviously, the internet is a relatively new phenomena. So how do we legislate around that? It isn't necessarily clear, because we haven't had any sort of historical context to go into, except for the telephone industry. Maybe if we see that people intrinsically cannot survive without the internet for whatever one reason or another, just because so much business is conducted on the internet, and especially through Facebook, it isn't unreasonable that the government could say, this is now a public entity. It is in the public's best interest if we operate this as if it is a public utility. It's not completely unreasonable, but at the same time, where do we draw the line in saying that, okay, Zuckerberg is now being limited by the government because he can't have complete control over the corporation that he founded privately?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma. And I would say we've now crossed that chasm where access to, you could call it either the internet or, high-speed cell phone access. I would say we have crossed that chasm where it's absolutely necessary for every American to be able to have that, especially because there's some financial institutions, I'm thinking of like Robinhood or Acorns Investment or some of these investment firms. There's not a branch of Robinhood Investment, which is an app that helps people buy, micro shares and invest. And it's really helping the small guy get access to financial products and investing money, a very small. You can't get access to that if you don't have the internet, right? So it's like there's certain products, there's certain livelihood items, there's certain financial tools and investments that you can no longer get if you don't have access to broadband internet or at least a cell phone signal. And I think once we've crossed that, where like you can't do a certain aspect of your banking, and that this just happens to be an area that I'm very familiar with, that it's like, yeah, that kind of becomes a public right. It's interesting. Yeah, I don't know that I want the government paying for it. I don't know if I want the government paying for everybody to have a new cell phone, but I think you have to have access to it.
So that essentially the point being that if you don't have access to a particular utility that you need to live, then that is your own problem. You either need to find a way to get access to that utility, or you need to pick something else that is accessible to you, because it's not someone else's job to provide for you to be able for you to be self-sufficient, that you should be self-sufficient. So that's another part of the libertarian argument that I think would get lost in this dichotomy between private versus public entities, but it's still an argument nonetheless. So how do we address that? I don't know. It's just as convoluted as saying whether or not the government should be overseeing Facebook because it's crossed a particular threshold to be considered a public entity. I don't know. I don't have the answer.
Right. You know, you did mention something several times throughout the last hour and a half or so that we've been talking. You know, you talked about using some more facts-based science, statistics, data to make decisions, to evaluate arguments. I'm interested, where do you think on certain issues, libertarian issues or libertarian hotspots of conversation, where are some areas that you think libertarianism is winning on the data points or the statistics or the science? You know, a lot of the COVID conversation or the global warming conversation or whatever has all gone to like, well, it's the science, you know, go to the science, go to the stats. And we all know stats and science can be manipulated in a myriad of ways. But what issues do you think libertarians could point to and be like, no, we have the facts here. We have the empirical evidence that this is correct, or this is the correct way to do it. Where would you think that libertarian wins when it comes to the science?
See, it's hard to say, because regardless of the data or how accurate it is, there's always going to be people that naysay or pinpoint and say that we're cherry picking facts, no matter what the argument may be. We could look at total gun crime rate and say that, hey, that only 10% of the actual gun deaths are homicides, and then of those, of X amount of gun homicides that are that exist in the United States, and overwhelming proportion or a certain proportion of them are due to the illicit drug market, which can never be regulated by any sort of government intervention. And then, but that's somewhat seems to be arbitrary to people that are on the left and that don't look at necessarily the gun crime that can't be prevented. And then they look at the suicides and say, well, maybe intervention here could be preventative, when as if they act like this particular issue is some sort of based on some sort of impulsive intuition. So it's hard to say where libertarians or anyone is winning on the statistical grounds, because all statistics are now contested, regardless of whether they're come from reliable sources or whether they're even valid or not. It's just a contest to use facts in a way that pushes an agenda, regardless of the truthfulness in the way that they are presented.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I've been trying to do some more research and reading on, because I think a little bit what you're talking about is never being able to prove the counterfactual, right? So it's like we can look at trend lines, we can look at statistics and whatnot, but you can't really ever say, well, here's the number of gun deaths we have with guns being legal and there being 70 million gun owners and 360 million guns out there, whatever the case may be. But, you know, the counterfactual would be if we outlawed all guns, there would be no gun deaths. There's no way to prove that. There's no way to prove the counterfactual, so it's so hard. But a couple of things I think we can look at empirically, you know, and I like to mess with my Republican friends by talking about the war on drugs, and I like talking to my, you know, messing with my liberal friends about the war on poverty. You can look at both of them being trillions of dollars of expenditures on the gun, you know, the war on guns, and getting us really into really horrible quagmires in places like Colombia and Nicaragua and Grenada and whatnot. And then we can look at the, you know, war on poverty, that trillions and trillions of dollars on spending, and we haven't put a dent since, you know, the 1960s on the overall number of Americans living in poverty. By some metrics, we've actually made it worse by making people that were in poverty generationally dependent on government handouts. So although you can't prove the counterfactual, I think we can kind of look on this war on drugs that was more pushed by conservatives, and the war on poverty that is more pushed by liberals or progressives. And it's like they've both failed at a huge level after trillions and trillions of dollars of spending. And both of these seem to come back to that libertarian talking point, whether it's drugs or your own ability to earn money. For the most part, for a vast majority of Americans, that's just an individual decision. That's an individual responsibility. You know, yes, there's people that are born in better environments and worse environments. And yes, once somebody is in poverty, it's harder to get out of poverty. I understand all of that. But at the end of the day, it's like the government has spent trillions of dollars on these two things to very little avail. Is that fair, or am I making some type of straw man argument that just won't hold up under scrutiny?
No, I think that is a completely accurate assessment. But yeah, both of those efforts by government intervention have been unmitigated failures. And to continue to expend resources into it is completely irresponsible. But then we also have the issue of when we perpetuate these sort of altruistic, expenditures, we spend money in this mechanism that doesn't necessarily go to the problem that we're actually looking to attack. Let's take, the multiple stimulus bills that we've seen in the past year alone, with billions of dollars going to things that aren't related to what the bills are intended to support. We have these COVID stimuli, but then we have all these line items on top of it, all this fat on top of it, and this giant omnibus bill that goes beyond the scope of what it was supposed to be in the first place. And that seems to be the case with most legislation that gets passed through the U.S. Congress. It's just that it's just fat. That doesn't go to what it's actually intended to go to. The war on drugs, granted, I wasn't around for that, obviously, but likely had a lot of fat. There are very few bills that don't have fat and it's just extra money that we're spending on things that need not be at that particular point in time. If you want to spend money on bullshit, then do it at another time. But if you're going to focus a bill on a particular issue, then focus the bill on that issue and not other bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's interesting. I'm thinking back and somebody's going to fact check me and prove that my dates are all wrong, but you'll get the overarching concept. So whenever it was March, April, that we started to have this idea that we're going to go into lockdowns, and the government decided they needed to spend 800 billion, 900 billion, whatever the case it was. I remember just looking at the calendar, because I'm constantly looking at people's paychecks and tax returns. And in my real life, I do mortgages. And I remember looking, I was like, wait a minute. People work for a couple of weeks, and then they get a paycheck usually about a week later. And then that usually affects bills that are due a week later, right? And by the time they had locked down, 90% of America had literally not even missed their first paycheck. And the government was trying to find a way to spend $900 billion and do PPP loans and direct deposits to people accounts, many of whom maybe would need it if they didn't have a job, many of which, if you means tested them, they're fine without the $600 or the $800 or the $1,200 or whatever the dollar figure ends up being. And I'm like, holy shit, can we just slow down? And again, this goes back to the personal responsibility. Can we just slow down that before people have even missed their first paycheck, we're trying to inject $900 billion into the economy, where maybe part of the conversation should be a little bit on cue with, what Dave Ramsey teaches with his total money makeover and financial security. Maybe all Americans should be a little bit more focused on having a rainy day fund, to where if there is something that's going to disrupt a weekly paycheck or a bi-weekly paycheck, and I understand there's a lot of people in a lot of tough situations that are living paycheck to paycheck, and I'm just showing my privilege, and maybe I'm just this rich white guy that doesn't understand, although I have plenty of friends who are dead broke. It feels like that could have been a moment of conversation for the country of hey, we're going to go into this lockdown for 2 weeks, and we want to focus either now or going forward on a little bit more financial literacy. And Americans, maybe if you're making $25,000 or $30,000 a year and you can't afford to miss one paycheck, maybe you shouldn't own an Xbox or the most recent iPhone or a big screen TV. And there should be some personal financial responsibility. But there's such this call to action by all politicians to fix the problem and spend money and interject capital. So can you talk a little bit about where that mindset comes from, or what you think is maybe wrong with that mindset? Because I'm sure you agree with me on this, that it's like, whoa. The government is not responsible for all dollar figures that go into the economy. What am I missing here? Or what am I getting right?
See, it becomes this sort of, dependency is exactly the term I would use for it. But the problem is, I feel like there's this disconnect between government and the people, and that the government expects people to spend responsibly. And I believe that individuals should be spending responsibly and should be held accountable for their personal finances. But at the same time, no one is holding the government in check for living within their means. They'll tell the taxpayer, they'll tell the people making X amount of dollars a year, if they are living paycheck to paycheck, they should be living within their means, but then they are just conned into a system where they're forking over their money to individuals that will just continue to ask for more money when they run out. And that's not how real life works for us individuals, but we're buying into a system where we're paying all this money for people to just say, well, we're out of money, guys, we just spend more. It's okay. So I don't know. Because I sympathize with those that don't necessarily have the means to live beyond paycheck to paycheck. But at the same time, I also, again, believe that if you can cut the cost, you should be cutting the cost, but the same goes for government. The government should not be, indiscriminatory versus the people. They should both be living within their means. And if they can't, then something needs to be cut.
Yeah. It feels like a little bit like a parent who's a drug addict and then turns around and tells their kids not to do drugs, right? Like you can't really have it. You can't really have it both ways. And now, by the way, fast forward 10 months. Now I am sympathetic to the people that need government subsidies, unemployment, PPP loans. I am now sympathetic to them because of the government overreach of stopping you from earning a living. I smoke a lot of cigars, as you can probably tell. I usually smoke 2 or 3 of them during these podcasts, but I go to a lot of cigar lounges, and I'm members at a couple different ones. And, in talking to them, they're like, hey, there is no historical precedence for the government coming in and telling me that I can't work or keep my business open or have people into this lounge to smoke cigars for 10 months. Like, okay, maybe there's a disruption of business. Maybe there's a zoning ordinance. Maybe there's some new tax and I've got to readjust my price structure and readjust the cost of my cigars. And, maybe there's a new study that comes out that shows cigars create lip cancer, and I've got to get over that with my people that shop here. But the idea of the government shutting them down for 10 months and saying, no, you cannot earn a living here in the state of California. Now I'm sympathetic to them being like, well, what do? Do I take out the PPP loans? Do I, in their mind, unethically go on unemployment? Like, I understand that dilemma, because most small businesses, restaurants, cigar lounges, gyms that are independently owned, they don't have a year of reserves sitting on the books where they can't take any revenue in, but they're also expected to pay their expenses and their insurance and their rent. So now I am sympathetic for them, but going back to that moment in time where it's like people hadn't even missed their first paycheck and the government's doling out money, like, that's just brutal. I mean, it just seems solely like ultimately fiscally irresponsible. And I don't know what we do about it, because now we've opened up the government teat so wide that who isn't taking or trying to get their fair share, right? Like, I've thought about filling out all the loan applications, because I'm like, well, I pay 45% in taxes. Why shouldn't I get mine? And, luckily our family is very blessed and the mortgage industry has done well. So we've actually been able to avoid having to take any of those subsidies and help other people in our community. But it creates this real moral hazard, right? Because if I'm thinking about doing it, everybody has to be thinking about doing it. And maybe that's the problem. Is that the underlying problem of this overspending and this government overreach, that now we've created so much moral hazard? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's definitely a confound to think about, is because exactly when we were all, I mean, duped into believing this would be a 2-week issue. Sure, I mean, people on both sides are going to say, well, if you just did your part, I mean, this would be over already. I mean, whatever. If you want to believe that fallacy, go for it. But yeah, when this is a 2-week issue and people are out here, expecting a check, then yeah, that's a problem. Because if you don't have, forget 3 months. I mean, if you don't have 2 weeks of reserve, yes, that's generally problematic for a majority of the population if you can't have that much money left over. At the same time, Now we've created a system where it's almost impossible for people to be able to live on their own without government assistance, because we have taken away so many means of people's livelihood. My best friend has been out of work since really since this started, because she worked at a theater, so they shut down. I mean, other theaters have reopened since, but the one she works at in particular has been shut down since March. So she's been out of work for 10 months, and she's a full-time student. So, how do we resolve the dilemma of people that can't go back to work, that want to go back to work, and then dole that out against the people that are more than capable of going back to work but choose not to because they are getting all this money from the government?
Yeah, I think we've created two underclasses right now, and this is just, I mean, this is the typical government problem of unintended consequences, right? We've created one group of people that's like, well, I can make a similar amount of money without working as I could have when I was working, so why go back to work, or
exactly,
or why beat the pavement, pound the pavement and find myself another job? So we've created this underclass of kind of dependent people. And then on the other side of it, it's like, I don't want government subsidies going to private corporations to keep them alive, because let's just take the AMC movie theater chain. If AMC doesn't have good corporate governance, if they don't have good financial reserves, if they don't have a good product, if people choose not to go to the movies anymore, I want AMC to fail, because that's what corporations are supposed to do. Businesses are supposed to fail if people aren't using their products. And I don't want the government picking winners and losers and coming in and giving AMC theaters $5 billion to stay afloat. But at the same time, I also don't think the government should have been able to tell AMC theaters that you have to shut down and you can't sell your product. So it's like we have government as the problem, and then they become the solution, and then their solution becomes a problem, so then they have to become the solution. And when does it stop? So where would the libertarian, if we could wave a magic wand and Joe Jorgensen was president tomorrow, which, God, wouldn't that be awesome? If we could wave a magic wand and the Libertarian Party was a viable party and they got some elected officials, what would the libertarian solution be to this? Government creates a solution that creates another problem. Now they gotta fund another solution, which creates another problem. Like where do libertarians start if we could magically infiltrate the government?
We'll see. Again, government being a problem and solution is very problematic, because government hardly ever is a solution, but it would certainly like to believe it is. Government intrinsically is a problem, and then it is the only mechanism to solve the problems that it creates. But if, for a libertarian, they would say, I mean, as, controversial as it may be, just to say, okay, let's just open it back up. You people are expected to take care of yourselves. If you're waiting for the government to take care of you, that's just irresponsible. I mean, for adults that are, for working age people, you should be more than capable of doing things for yourself. And obviously there are extraneous circumstances where that isn't the case, where, yes, the government is a necessary tool for individuals that don't have the capacity to support themselves. But at the same time, it is not the government's job to save you from yourself. I mean, that's one of the reasons I hate seatbelt laws and hate marijuana laws, or any drug law, really. The government is not there to save you from yourself. It's merely a tool to, going back to like John Locke and the classical liberals, it's a tool to mediate and keep individuals from infringing upon one another's individual liberties. And if it does anything more than that, then it's a problem. So take government entirely out of the equation, that's the solution.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, a lot of people would push back and say, well, without the government, do we end up having Operation Warp Speed and creating a vaccine in record time of 10 months, 11 months, however quickly it was created? And I think the answer from most libertarians would be like, well, yeah, there will be a private company that will step in for a profitable reason and create the vaccine in 6 months or 5 months, or get rid of the FDA, and maybe the vaccine was created in 2 months. I don't know that I would want to take a vaccine that was created in 2 months, but the FDA might have been an impediment to getting this solved faster. So when we talk like this, I think there's the temptation for anybody that would disagree with us to just say, oh, well, Tyler and Scott are heartless, right? So because we don't want the government to step in and be the nanny state, and we don't want them to solve everybody's problems. And that could very much lend itself to like, well, these people are heartless. They don't understand. They don't care about their fellow man. They don't want the government to help anybody. Where do you think maybe we go one of two directions. Where do you think is the government's role to to help or subsidize or protect? And then where does the libertarian take care of their common man? Maybe talk to either one of those.
Well, I think for a libertarian, not necessarily the government is intrinsically evil. I think at the local level, small government, what Republicans would tout, they say is important to them, small government. I think it's possible to keep small local government as a mechanism to care for one another in a way that is fiscally responsible, because those are the institutions that have much fewer means and rely a lot on public support and public donation and public investment and the interaction of people with one another to be able to continue society. It's not necessarily that all government is bad. It's that the federal government and the federal bureaucracy is a bloated expense that doesn't create any solutions to the problems it creates. It's if we think smaller and not expect everyone in DC to solve our problems, we'll be better off. It's that you should have an avenue to people that to be able to solve these problems. And that doesn't necessarily mean the people that are in government, but even, your neighbors. There was a time when being neighborly and helping one another was touted, but now everyone's isolated and afraid of each other. And we run to the government for help. And that's terrifying, because that should not be the case. It should be the opposite. We should want as little government as possible, because they are the institution. They are the establishment with the only establishment with the capacity to kill people legally. Why would I want more of that?
Yeah,
I don't, but that's what we defer to.
Yeah, that's interesting. The being neighborly, the pushing. I think this is like a tenet of the libertarian mindset is, as much as possible, push down to the lowest level of possible,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Like my dream is to be live in like maybe Austin, Texas, or something like that, where it's a blue dot, so you get a lot of diverse opinion, you get a lot of cultural diversity, you get a lot of culture, but it's a blue dot in a red state, right? Because I want the government lower taxes, less regulation, as little involvement as possible. But if my little tiny local government wants to put, all of the property tax money towards, I don't know, pick the topic of the month, transsexual little people theater cast or whatever, it doesn't matter. Like whatever the local community decides that they want to support at a cultural level, I think that's so much more important than having some, to your point, omnibus spending bill where the federal government collects $10 million in taxes to send to Pakistan for gender studies. Like, how the fuck is that helping anybody in the United States? It's just pure insanity. Okay, so your point is we push it down to the local level as much as possible, whether that's neighborly, city government, churches, people that really have a direct avenue to the people that are spending the money, and then where, if at all, do you think the federal government can get involved on federal safety net program, or social safety net programs, federal spending for Social Security, things of that nature? Does that just go all away and get phased out and means tested over time, or is there a place for that stuff in the libertarian mindset? What is your thought?
Well, I think the federal government is still a way to bridge these local and state level markets and governments together, but it shouldn't be anything more than a mediator between these different ideas that come out of these states and these local governments. I mean, it can handle the big, very expensive projects to some degree, but to say that it should be the first option when it comes to any sort of conflict is problematic, because each state, each county, each municipality is very unique in its own way and have diverse needs. So when we have an entity that is attempting to accommodate all these needs but fails to do so, its necessity is very little, but it's it's soaking up so much of our funds, so much taxpayer money, that it's not necessarily useful unless there is a project that, one state or a conglomeration of states can't solve alone. That's what it should be for, is that when these projects get way too big for the entities that are attempting to handle them, then yeah, there should be a mechanism like a federal government that handles these really big, long forethought projects. But unfortunately, forethought isn't something most of the people in government have.
Right, right. So something like the, interstate system, building freeways across the nation
Exactly.
maybe makes sense
Yeah.
for federal government. Federal government deciding that the, Kennedy Center gets $100 million for a facelift so that it can be a more beautiful
Fucking ridiculous.
museum. I mean, just insanity, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, even break down this last bill. There are 200. Fact check me if I'm wrong, Chris, but I think last I checked, there are 206, somewhere between 205 and 210 million working age individuals in the United States. The workforce percentage, I'll be generous and say 70 to 75%, even though the number is around 60%. You're talking maybe 150 million taxpayers at most. On average, they would have spent 6,000 plus on that bill to get $600 back. And if that's not asinine, I don't know what is.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, and I think the number of taxpayers, we probably have to quantify it because everybody probably pays some level of tax on sales tax and whatnot, but that's local. But I would say people that are paying federal income taxes,
Federal tax.
I would be shocked if people paying a net number to federal taxes is over 100 million people. I would suspect that we're maybe closer to 50 or 60 million people.
It says
I'm
the
being
labor
very
force.
generous.
The labor force reached a high of 164.6 million people in February of 2020.
Okay.
Nice. So that's the
So,
available
there's
workforce.
Yeah.
Correct. That included unemployed people.
Maybe 70% of that.
Maybe 70% of that is actually working.
So that's maybe 70% of that's actually working.
Yeah, so we end up with somewhere around, say, 100, 110 million people that are
120.
working, 120 million people that are part of the workforce. And of those people, effectively, if you make under $30,000, $40,000, effectively you're paying no federal taxes by the time you have this write-off and this credit and this, standard deduction. So, say maybe 120 million people, maybe 30, 40, 58 million of them are making under $40,000 a year, which means they're effectively paying zero federal income tax. So you probably end up with 50 to 60 million taxpayers, federal taxpayers, that are paying a net number into the system, that are paying for everything. And to your point, those people are paying
back.
Yeah, those people are paying somewhere on to the tune of $6,000 out of that bill that was just spent to get $600 back because we've got to fund all these other projects. I mean, the math just rarely makes sense.
Yeah.
And reading through that bill, which I didn't read all 5,000 pages, but I went to some of the, I went to some of my, favorite punching bags, the foreign aid and whatnot. I remember reading 140 million went to the country of Georgia, not the state of Georgia, and 540 million went to Ukraine. And, 40 million went here and 30 million went there and 8 million went to Belize and 12 million went here, because it seems like there's a bunch of holdovers from the Cold War or the Reagan administration or the 80s and the 90s who think like, well, the only way to keep us from going to war with Russia is to bolster up these border states of Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, whatever the case may be. Like, this international policeism and the growing just endless glut of the military in the United States, which I was part of that military. I have a lot of respect for the people that served in the military, but just the glut of all this funding seems like a leftover from the Cold War era. So would libertarians, if again we can wave a magic wand and Joe Jorgensen was president, would libertarians, would they just cut all of that, like no foreign funding whatsoever, eliminate any budget that goes towards the UN, like let them deal with their own problems, and if Russia takes over half of Europe, oh well, it is what it is? Like, where does the libertarian stand on foreign aid and foreign military intervention?
Well, see, this is another problem, because to some degree, libertarians would say we have an obligation to protect ourselves, and if that's the mechanism that we need to utilize to be able to do it, then maybe go for it. But when we're talking about a near $1 trillion defense budget for non-existent conflict that we're going out of our way to create, when we could not necessarily just not interfere with these particular Middle Eastern countries or these Eastern European countries, then we're having a different conversation. I mean, we think about the second war in Iraq and how the means through which that even started. I mean, we could, chalk it up. You can buy into the Bush, Saddam Hussein, whatever sort of justification we had for going to war. But either way, that cost money and lives that were needlessly spent on something that was started through some sort of falsification by the government based on some intelligence that they didn't actually have. So I don't know, it's problematic because we have an obligation to protect ourselves and our country and our citizens, but at the same time, there are mechanisms to do it that don't involve us spending $1 trillion on a stimulus or on an annual defense budget that needlessly soaks up taxpayer funds that they could be using to defend themselves or make a livelihood or literally anything else other than having these weapons of mass destruction that are just sitting to be used whenever. I mean, and it hurts. It's hard because other nation states are doing this as well. They're bolstering their arms as well. So to some degree, we have to respond to that and be prepared. But how much is too much? And I think we've crossed the threshold of how much money we should be spending on defense when we have the largest. Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the largest, if not the largest, standing military in the world, and spend more on defense than any of the next like 10 to 15 countries combined.
Yeah. I think that's all accurate. And it's interesting. This is probably going to be, or this is going to be construed as the most heartless thing that I have maybe said yet on this podcast. But in a complicated society like the one in which we live, and I know it's hard in the moment to say this or think about this or try to think rationally, but in the complicated society in which we live, bad things are going to happen, right? So another 9/11-ish type situation is going to happen. It's a tragedy. The bad things about tragedies is they always happen, and the good things about tragedies is they always pass. But what I think we've seen out of the modern government, and I'll use a couple different examples here so I will equally piss off everybody on the right and the left, is after 9/11, there was this rush to, create Department of Homeland Security and the TSA and FISA courts, which are now spying on Americans and all kinds of stuff in the name of protection. And, something bad happened, so we have to do something. And it's like, well, that's how we felt. But if we now look back the 20-year history of Homeland Security and TSA agents and all of this stuff, have we really captured that return on investment, right? Was it really a net positive to create brand new government bureaucracies? And that's something that will probably piss off most of the people on the right who support the military and say that I don't have top secret clearance. I don't know all of the terrorist attacks that they've stopped. Maybe they have. But there's when bad things happen, there is this response to like create a new agency, create new bureaucracy. We've got to show the populace that we're doing something without ever talking about a return on investment. And just to make sure that I equally piss off all of my friends on the left, after the BP oil spill, there was like, oh, well, we've got to create new regulations and we've got to create a new bureaucracy where if you just look at offshore drilling, I remember reading about this, there was something like 11 government agencies that were already monitoring and supposedly making safe offshore drilling. Like the Coast Guard has to inspect this part of it, and the EPA has to inspect this part of it, and the Better Business blah 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 government agency has to sign off on this. So it's like offshore drilling is about as safe as it can humanly possibly be. It's about as safe as it can mathematically possibly be. But there was a tragedy, and tragedies are going to happen in a complex society. And our initial gut reaction is like, well, we need new regulation, and we need this, and we need to create a new bureaucracy, and the EPA needs this new funding, because if we had only done these things and put these people in place, then we would have stopped that tragedy. But the problem is you end up getting to a point where like you can't turn everybody into a government employed stormtrooper who's just creating more regulation and being part of the bureaucracy, because then eventually nobody's doing the work. And so I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a human. I'm an American. I don't want bad things to happen, but I also think I'm a pragmatic person who's like, hey man, in societies, some bad shit's going to happen sometimes, and government can't fix all of it. So how do we start to have a more honest, genuine conversation when tragedies happen to where it doesn't just create a new giant bureaucracy?
Well, the funny thing about when these things happen is that everyone rallies behind the government, and that really sort of creates this sense that, oh, okay, well, if we're all in support of the government, maybe we should utilize more government. In reality, it's just a temporary lapse in long-term forethought, because we expect government to solve these big tragedies when they occur. So I think that it's just recognizing that, again, like, shit's gonna happen. Like, bad things happen every day, and to act as if the government, if people can prevent these sort of things from happening just by their mere presence, or just by utilizing these funds to create bureaucratic agencies that do question mark fill in the blank, I don't know, it's just not realistic. So I think looking at what these agencies actually do now and getting people to understand that if these agencies aren't actually doing anything, then they don't need to exist. That, or if they do exist, they can be downsized. Their administrative costs can be butchered completely if they aren't if there isn't an active need for them to be operating the way that they had operated when there was a perceived threat or perceived need, then they don't need to exist. But unfortunately, that's just, I think that's too broad for most people to understand. I think most Americans are just politically inept and probably always will be.
Well, that is a disappointing thought to leave a podcast on. So why don't you give us something positive for the future, or a prediction? Again, we're recording this in January, early 2021. Give us some positive forethought, something that you see that's going well, maybe a direction the government or the populace is taking that you're encouraged by. And we'll try to end here on a positive thought after talking about how bad things are for the last 2 hours.
Yeah, yes, that's true. I am encouraged to see more people questioning the government, more encouraged to see people questioning the media to some degree. I still see a lot of pundits buying into the big corporate media, the big media conglomerates that control the masses, that control what information people see. But I am encouraged to see that more people are realizing that they are the problem and not necessarily the solution to the many ills and ails that we have in American society. So it's encouraging to see that people are starting to, to some degree, think for themselves, even though that we are more tribal than ever. We have more people questioning the people that are telling us what to do, despite the fact that they get to do what they want. So having, not necessarily being a skeptic, but being, or not necessarily being a cynic, but being a skeptic is something that seems to be increasing in popularity, and that's something that should be encouraging for the future.
Yeah, I love that. And it kind of brings us full circle, right? Like, if you take the personal responsibility for the type of news you consume and the type of facts that you're believing, because you fact check them, not just because you saw them on your network station of choice. That is encouraging. And hopefully we don't slide into the point where no experts are believed. But I think a fair amount of skepticism from somebody who's a talking head and a pundit, like that's definitely a good thing for the country and the populace. So
I think so too.
I want to say thanks for being on, man. I've enjoyed the conversation. We'll definitely have you back as we refine this podcast and we're ready to get information out faster. You can be definitely one of our go-to political talking people and give us some talking points on what we're seeing in current events. So I really appreciate you being on, man. I think this might be the beginning of a very long friendship.
I hope so. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's been awesome. I look forward to engaging with you more, just because it's refreshing to have political conversation that's civil. So it's a rare thing these days.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. And I'm going to have similar types of civil conversation with some people that consider themselves massive conservatives, massive progressives. So everybody will kind of get their flavor of the month. And I forgot to ask you, what are you even getting your PhD in at Brown? What's the program you're in over there?
I'm in their political science program, but I plan to specialize in American politics and hopefully do stuff with political psychology or political behavior. So get to be one of those pollsters that everyone comes to hate these days.
Perfect. Well, nothing like spending your life working to a career where you'll be hated. I can relate.
Oh, good.
So, all right, man, I'm going to let you go. We'll talk soon. And next time we're going to fly you into LA so we can talk in person.
Look forward to it.
All right, man. Talk later.
Thanks, Scott.